There is a road in Appalachia that doesn't appear in most GPS systems. It doesn't have a rest stop. It doesn't have lighting. It runs through a stretch of mountain that locals have had a name for longer than anyone can remember, and that name is not something they say out loud at night. Most people, if they know the road at all, know it because someone they trusted told them about it once, quietly, and then asked them never to take it after dark. Some of them listened. Some of them didn't. And the ones who didn't, the ones who drove it anyway, who told themselves it was just a road, just asphalt and tree line and mountain air, they came out the other side different. Not hurt. Not always. Not visibly. But different. Like something had shifted slightly in the way they understood the world, in the way they understood themselves, and they couldn't put into words exactly what had changed. They just knew that it had. This is a collection of their accounts. 6 people. 6 different years. 6 different reasons for being on that road after dark. And what they share is not the road itself. It's what they brought back from it. Marcus drove freight for 19 years. He wasn't the kind of man who talked about things he couldn't explain. He wasn't the kind of man who told stories. But he told this one once, to a mechanic at a truck stop outside of Kingsport, and the mechanic told someone else. And eventually, it made its way forward through a chain of people who all said the same thing before passing it along. I don't know if I believe it, but I know he wasn't lying. Marcus had a delivery to make. He was behind schedule, had been since Ohio, and by the time he reached the mountains, the sun had already gone down, and he had 200 miles left to go. He knew about the road. His dispatcher had mentioned it once, years earlier, as a shortcut, and then immediately told him to forget he'd said anything, that it wasn't worth it after dark. Marcus hadn't asked why. He was the kind of man who didn't ask questions he already knew the answer to, and the answer to that one felt obvious enough. But he was tired, and he was behind. And when you've been driving as long as Marcus had, you develop a relationship with time that makes ordinary logic feel different. He told himself he would just see it, just get close enough to decide. The entrance to the road was marked by a gas station that had been closed for a long time. Not recently closed. The kind of closed where the windows are so filmed over you can't tell if there was ever anything inside. Where the sign out front had faded to the point where whatever name it once carried was now just a pale rectangle against a rusted pole. He pulled the truck off the highway and sat there for a moment with the engine running. And he said that was when something about it didn't feel right. Not the station. The air around it. Something about the quality of the dark on the other side of those trees felt thicker than it should have. Not foggy. Not smoky. Just dense in a way that made his eyes want to move past it rather than into it. But he pulled in anyway. Because 19 years of driving teaches you that almost everything that feels wrong at the beginning turns out to be nothing. He told himself it was just the mountains playing with the light. He told himself that, and he believed it enough to turn down the road. The first few miles were ordinary. Narrow, barely wide enough for the truck, and the tree line on both sides came close enough that branches scraped the roof of the cab occasionally, a sound he compared to fingernails on something dry. He didn't think much of it at first. Mountain roads did strange things to sound. The asphalt was older than the highways, cracked in patterns that sent small vibrations up through the steering wheel at irregular intervals. And after a while he noticed that those intervals weren't completely random. There was something almost rhythmic about them, not exactly a pattern, but close enough to one that he started counting the spaces between them without deciding to. He drove for about 40 minutes before he saw the first light. It was off the road, maybe 200 feet into the tree line on the passenger side. Small, steady, not flickering the way a fire would, not moving the way a flashlight would. Just a point of pale yellow light sitting in the trees, the way a window might look from a distance, except there was no structure around it he could see. No shape, no outline, just the light itself, alone in the dark. And he slowed down for it. Not to a stop, but enough to look. And when he looked, the light didn't move. It didn't change. It just stayed there. And he had the feeling, the specific and difficult to articulate feeling, that it had been there for a very long time. Not waiting, not watching, just present in the way that some things in the mountains are present, without explanation or purpose or any understanding of what they mean to the people who happen to pass by them. He told himself it was a house set back from the road. He told himself that and kept driving. But after a while he started to notice small things. Things that didn't feel wrong at first, just different enough to stay in the back of his mind. The road had begun to feel different. Not the surface of it, the character of it. Like the quality of the silence outside had changed, like the engine was louder now than it should have been, and the sound of it was being absorbed differently by whatever was around him. He turned the radio on. It gave him static for a moment, then a voice, low and not quite clear enough to make out the words, and then static again. He turned it off. He didn't try it again. The second thing he noticed was the mile markers. He'd been counting them when he turned onto the road, a habit from years of long hauls, and they had been consistent, evenly spaced. But somewhere after the first hour they had stopped. Not immediately. He'd missed too, assumed he hadn't been paying attention, told himself the spacing was probably irregular on an old mountain road. But by the time he realized he hadn't seen one in almost 40 minutes, he understood that something about the distance was not behaving the way it should. He had fuel enough. He wasn't lost. The road hadn't branched. He was still moving forward. But forward, by that point, felt like a direction that no longer meant exactly what it had when he'd started. He thought about pulling over. He thought about it seriously, the way you think about something when part of you already knows what you're going to do and the other part is just working through the logic of getting there. And then the road curved, a long, slow curve to the left, and when he came around it, he saw the car. It was parked on the shoulder. A sedan, dark-colored, dark enough that he almost didn't see it until he was close. And when he got close enough, he could see that it was empty. No lights, no hazards, no one standing outside it. Just the car, sitting there with the driver's door standing open. And he stopped. He sat in the truck and looked at it through the windshield for what he estimated was 3 or 4 minutes. Though he acknowledged later that time on that road didn't behave the way it should have. He looked at the car, and he thought about the door being open. About how long a door would have to be open in that air, in those mountains, for condensation to form along the top edge of the frame the way it had. And he decided not to get out. It wasn't fear, he said. He wasn't afraid. He was just certain, in the way you are sometimes certain of things without any reason you could explain, that getting out of the truck on that road, at that moment, was not something he should do. So he didn't. He drove around the sedan carefully, and he kept going, and he didn't look in the rearview mirror until the curve had taken it out of sight. He told himself someone had pulled over and walked back up the road for help. He told himself that, and almost believed it. But even as he was telling himself that, he knew something about it didn't feel right. And the feeling stayed with him for the rest of the drive. He came out the other side of the road just before 3 in the morning. The highway opened up the way it does after a long stretch of mountain driving. The sky suddenly wider, and the lights of a town visible in the valley below. He pulled into the first gas station he found and sat there for a long time with the engine off. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't frightened. He was, he said, simply quiet in a way he hadn't been in a long time. A quietness that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with the particular feeling of having seen something you can't categorize. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the structure of ordinary experience, and so simply sits there at the edge of your understanding, like a word in a language you almost recognize. He pumped gas. He bought coffee. He drove the remaining 40 miles to his delivery and was 3 hours late and didn't explain why. He never took the road again. He never went back to see if the sedan was still there. He said he didn't want to know the answer. That some answers are worse than the question. And I understood what he meant by that, though I couldn't have said exactly why. There was a time when I thought the worst thing that could happen on a long drive alone was running out of gas. And then I spoke to a woman named Carrie who drove that road in October, 3 years ago, and she told me what she found in the passenger seat, and I stopped thinking about gas at all. Carrie was driving home from her sister's house. It was late, close to midnight, and she'd made the drive enough times to know the way by memory. The shortcut had come up before. One of her co-workers had mentioned it once, said it cut 40 minutes off the mountain pass, said he'd driven it in the day and it was fine. She'd asked about night, and he'd gotten quiet in a way she hadn't expected and said he didn't know, that he hadn't tried it at night, that there was probably no reason not to, but that he hadn't tried it. She filed that away. She didn't ask why. She should have asked why. There was a time when I thought the worst thing that could happen on a long drive alone was running out of gas. And then I spoke to a woman named Carrie who drove that road in October, 3 years ago, and she told me what she found in the passenger seat, and I stopped thinking about gas at all. Carrie was driving home from her sister's house. It was late, close to midnight, and she'd made the drive enough times to know the way by memory. The shortcut had come up before. One of her co-workers had mentioned it once, said it cut 40 minutes off the mountain pass, said he'd driven it in the day and it was fine. She'd asked about night, and he'd gotten quiet in a way she hadn't expected and said he didn't know, that he hadn't tried it at night, that there was probably no reason not to, but that he hadn't tried it. She filed that away. She didn't ask why. She should have asked why. Carrie was not someone who frightened easily. She'd grown up in the mountains, in a county small enough that everyone knew the roads by feel rather than by name. And she'd spent enough of her childhood in the dark, in the woods, at the edges of things that most people found unsettling, to know the difference between the kind of dark that's just dark and the kind that carries something else inside it. She believed, or she had believed, that she could always tell which was which, that she had a sense for it. That sense, she would later say, failed her completely the night she took the shortcut. She almost didn't. She'd driven past the turn twice in previous months without taking it, each time telling herself she'd try it in the daylight first, the way sensible people do. But on this particular night, she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation and everything to do with the kind of exhaustion that settles into you after a long visit with family, a pleasant one even, but the kind of pleasant that still costs you something by the end. She wanted to be home. She wanted her own bed and her own quiet and the particular dark of her own bedroom. And the idea of 40 minutes back on her journey was enough to make the shortcut feel like the rational choice for the first time. She turned down the road at 11:47. She remembered the time because she'd looked at the clock specifically to calculate how long the drive back would take if she cut the 40 minutes. She was doing arithmetic, she said. She was thinking about sleep. She was not thinking about anything that mattered. The road was everything she'd been told it was in the physical sense. Narrow and old and bordered by trees that hadn't thinned in probably 40 years. The headlights caught the tree line close on both sides and gave the drive a tunneled quality, the way night roads through dense forest always do, where the world contracts to just the cone of light in front of you, and everything else becomes suggestion and shadow. She'd driven roads like that before. It didn't bother her. What bothered her, though she didn't register it as bothering her at first, was the silence. She had music on when she turned onto the road. She remembered this clearly, a playlist she'd put together years ago and still returned to on long drives. And sometime in the first 10 minutes of the road, she became aware that she hadn't heard it in a while. Not that it had stopped. Not that there had been any interruption she'd noticed. Just that at some point she had stopped hearing it. And when she reached forward and touched the volume dial and turned it up, the sound that came back to her felt thin and distant, the way audio sounds when you've been drifting and the world is slowly coming back to you. She told herself she'd been more tired than she thought. She told herself she'd zoned out and lost track of the music the way you sometimes do on a long drive when your brain detaches from the immediate and floats somewhere else for a while. She turned it up a little more and focused on the road and drove. But after a while she started to notice small things. Things that didn't feel wrong at first, just different enough to stay in the back of her mind. The temperature in the car had dropped. She was certain she hadn't touched the climate controls. The heat was on, had been on, and the car had been warm when she turned onto the road, warm in that comfortable sealed-in way that makes long night drives feel almost pleasant. But the warmth was gone now. Not dramatically. Not the way cold comes in when you roll a window down. More like something had quietly displaced it. Like the air in the car had been exchanged for something that had been sitting outside for a very long time. She reached for the heat dial and turned it up and waited. And the air stayed cold. Not uncomfortably so. Not enough to see her breath. Just cold in a way that didn't respond to the thing that should have corrected it. She told herself it was a malfunction. She told herself the heater had done this before, that she'd had it looked at twice in the last year, and it wasn't anything serious. She told herself that and believed most of it. And then the smell changed. It happened gradually, the way smells always arrive when they're not attached to anything obvious. A slow displacement of the interior smell of the car, the coffee she'd brought from her sister's house, the faint trace of the fabric softener her sister used on the blanket Carrie had been wrapped in on the couch most of the afternoon, by something that she could only describe later as the smell of outside. Not unpleasant, not chemical, just deeply, fundamentally outdoor. Soil and bark and the particular cold damp that lives at the base of old trees in autumn. The smell of something that had been in the mountain air for a long time. She didn't look at the passenger seat immediately. She said that was the thing she thought about most afterward, in the weeks that followed, in the quiet moments when the memory came back without invitation. She didn't look. She registered the smell. She registered the cold. And something in her, something below conscious thought, understood what those things meant before she did. And it didn't make her look. It made her keep her eyes on the road. She drove for another 2 or 3 minutes with her hands steady on the wheel, and the music low and the cold sitting in the car like something with weight to it. And she did not look at the passenger seat. And then she did. She told me later that she didn't decide to. That it wasn't a choice she made in any deliberate sense. It was more like her eyes simply corrected themselves, the way your vision adjusts when you've been staring in one direction too long. And in the correction, they moved right. And she saw it. Not a person. She was careful about this distinction when she described it to me. Careful in a way that suggested it mattered to her, that the difference was important. It was not a person. It was the shape of one, the suggestion of one. The same way you sometimes see a figure in the periphery of a dark room that resolves into a coat on a chair when you look directly at it. Except when she looked directly at it, it didn't resolve. It stayed. It sat in the passenger seat the way someone sits when they've been sitting for a long time and have settled into the shape of the seat and the posture of someone who intends to remain. It had the approximate form of a person, a height, a width, a general outline of shoulders, and a head. It was the texture that was wrong. The way light moved across it, or rather didn't move across it, the way light should if a physical body is sitting in a car seat in the glow of dashboard lights. It absorbed the light differently. Not darkness, not shadow, something between the two. Something that her brain kept trying to resolve and couldn't. She looked back at the road. Her hands were still on the wheel. She said this with a kind of subdued amazement, as though the fact that she had maintained that physical steadiness felt, in retrospect, impossible. Her hands were still on the wheel, and she was still driving, and the road was still moving under her headlights, and she was trying to do something with her breathing that would allow her to think clearly. She told herself it was a trick of the light. She told herself that, and she wanted to believe it, and she looked again, and it was still there. And this time it turned toward her. Not quickly, not dramatically. The kind of slow movement that you notice only because it has changed the relationship between two static things. The shape of the head, such as it was, such as she could interpret it, had oriented itself toward her, toward the driver's seat, and she felt something she couldn't name looking at her from a face she couldn't see. And in that moment the music stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The silence in the car was absolute in the way that silence only is when something has just ended. And in that silence, she heard it speak. She described the sound to me twice. The second time because I asked her to try again, because the first description felt almost impossible to hold on to. She said it sounded like someone speaking from the bottom of a very long way down. Like the voice had traveled an enormous distance to reach her and had lost everything except the essential shape of words in the journey. It wasn't loud. It wasn't close, even though whatever was producing it was sitting 18 inches from her. It said her name, just her name, the one syllable of it, with an inflection she couldn't categorize, not a question, not a greeting, not a warning. Just her name produced with a certainty that implied it had always known it. She said she asked it what it wanted. She said it didn't feel like bravery. It felt like the only thing her mouth knew how to do, and it didn't answer. It turned back toward the windshield, and it sat there, and the silence continued, and the cold continued, and she drove. She drove because stopping felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate, but trusted completely. She drove because the road was still there and the headlights were still working, and somewhere on the other side of the mountain, there was a town with lights, and other people, and the particular ordinary comfort of a world that behaved the way it was supposed to. She drove for what she estimated was another 20 minutes. Maybe more. Time, she said, had gone strange. Not in a way she could quantify. Just in the way that time goes strange when you are enduring something, and the only measure of progress is your own continued motion through it. The shape sat in the passenger seat for all of it. Occasionally she looked at it in the peripheral limit of her vision, unable to not look, the way you can't not look at a wound, and it remained. Sitting. Still. Facing forward. Once, in what she thought was the final stretch of the road, it made a sound that wasn't a word. A low sound, she said, like something settling. Like the sound a house makes when the temperature changes and the structure of it shifts slightly to accommodate the new reality. And then the trees broke. The road widened. The first light appeared, the orange glow of a gas station at the edge of a town, the kind of light that under normal circumstances you wouldn't think twice about. But that night felt like the most significant thing she'd ever seen in her life. And she looked at the passenger seat, and the shape was gone. Not fading, not disappearing the way things fade. Gone the way a thing is gone when it was never quite fully there to begin with. The seat was empty. The temperature in the car rose almost immediately, the heat working again suddenly and completely as though it had never stopped. The music came back on, the song that had been playing when it went silent. She pulled into the gas station and sat in the car for a long time. She called her sister. She didn't tell her what had happened, not that night, not for several months afterward. She just wanted to hear a voice that was familiar and wholly ordinary and fully in the world. Her sister talked about something inconsequential, a television program she'd been watching, a thing that had happened at work that week, and Carrie sat there and let the words come through the phone and fill the car and slowly, let herself feel like the world was the size it was supposed to be again. She drove home. She checked the passenger seat 3 times before she started the car, and once more when she stopped at a red light in the center of town. She got home at 1:42 in the morning. She didn't sleep until after 4. She told me that for weeks afterwards she avoided looking at the passenger seat when she got in the car. Not from fear exactly. From the specific discomfort of a person who has had their understanding of a thing permanently altered and hasn't yet found a way to integrate the new understanding into ordinary life. She said she still took the long route home. She said that sometimes on long night drives, when the road is quiet and the air in the car shifts slightly, and she can't immediately explain why, she keeps her eyes on the road and both hands on the wheel. And she doesn't look right. I didn't tell her I understood, but I did. Because once you've heard enough of these accounts, once you've listened to enough people describe the particular quality of that road at night, you start to understand something that doesn't fully make sense in daylight, but feels entirely true in the dark. Some roads remember the people who travel them, and some of them send something back. Most of the people who have stories about that road drove it once, maybe twice. They took it because they didn't know better, or because they were in a hurry, or because someone told them it was fine and they had no particular reason not to believe them. And then something happened and they didn't go back. That's the shape most of these accounts take. A single encounter, a single night, and then a deliberate, permanent avoidance that they never fully had to explain to anyone because they never went back far enough into the details to need to. Dale's account is different. Dale drove that road for 11 years. Every morning and every evening, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. He drove it because it was the most direct route between his house on the eastern slope and the mill where he worked, and because he had driven it so many times that it had become the kind of road you stop seeing after a while. The kind your hands know without your eyes. The kind that becomes less a place and more a duration. A stretch of time between one part of your life and another. He drove it in every season. In the blue-gray light of winter mornings when the frost sat on the asphalt, and the trees on either side were bare enough to see a long way into the woods. In the full green weight of summer when the canopy closed overhead and the road felt more like a tunnel than a mountain pass. In the autumn when the leaves came down fast enough that by the end of October you were driving through a layer of them that made the surface of the road feel slightly uncertain beneath the tires, the way ground feels when the thing below it is softer than it should be. He knew the road the way you know a house you've lived in for years. Every dip in the surface, every curve, every place where the tree line opened slightly on the right side, and you could catch a glimpse of the valley below if the light was right. He knew all of it. And for the first 8 years, he said, there was nothing unusual, nothing he would have described as wrong. It was a road. It was his road. He drove it, and he arrived at work, and he drove it again, and he arrived home, and the road was simply the space between those two places, ordinary in the complete and unremarkable way that the most familiar things in your life are ordinary. He said he thought about this a lot afterward, in the years after he stopped driving it. About those first 8 years. About whether there was something there that he had simply failed to notice, or whether it genuinely wasn't there yet. Whether whatever is on that road had simply not become aware of him yet. Whether awareness, for something like that, takes time. Whether 11 years of a person moving through the same space twice a day, wearing the same groove into the air, eventually constitutes something that can be noticed. He couldn't answer that. He said he wasn't sure he wanted to. The first thing he noticed was the deer. He'd seen deer on that road throughout the years, the way you see deer on any mountain road, occasionally and without pattern, in the early mornings sometimes, at dusk sometimes, standing at the edge of the tree line with their particular stillness and then moving away. Normal. Expected. Part of the landscape. But in the 9th year, the deer stopped. Not immediately. Gradually, the way a sound fades when its source moves away from you. He noticed it first in spring, a season when the deer on mountain roads were usually more visible, not less. He went 2 weeks without seeing a single one. Then a month. He told himself the herd had moved, that there were cycles to these things, that he wasn't a wildlife expert and had no particular basis for thinking anything was wrong. But after a while he started to notice small things. Things that didn't feel wrong at first, just different enough to stay in the back of his mind. It wasn't just the deer. It was everything. The birds he usually heard in the summer mornings, not always the same ones, not always the same calls, but a general presence of bird sound in the trees along that road, a background texture of living things going about their business in the canopy above. That too had diminished. Not all at once. Not so completely that he could point to a specific morning and say, that was the morning the birds were gone. But over the course of that 9th year, the road became quieter in a way he could feel, but couldn't precisely measure. Like something had asked the living things along it to give it a little space. He mentioned it to his wife once. She asked if he was sleeping enough. He said he was. He didn't mention it again. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in November of the 10th year. He was running slightly late, had left the house 7 minutes later than usual because of something small and domestic that he couldn't remember afterward, and because of those 7 minutes the light on the road was different than it usually was at that stretch of the drive. Just slightly. The sun was higher, and in that slightly different light, as he came around the long curve about 4 miles in, he saw something standing in the road. Not at the edge, in the middle of it. He slowed. His first thought was deer, which would have been ordinary, which was the reason he thought it. But it wasn't the shape of a deer. It was taller than a deer, and the proportions were wrong in a way he couldn't immediately locate. Wrong in the way a photograph is sometimes wrong before you can identify the specific element of it that's off. It was standing with its back to him, facing the direction he was traveling. He slowed to a stop about 50 feet from it, and sat there with his hands on the wheel and the engine idling. And it stood there, still, in the way that wild animals are sometimes still, with a quality of concentrated attention that you can feel even from a distance, even when you can't see their face. The quality of something that is aware of being observed and is deciding how to respond to it. He waited. He didn't honk, he said, though he couldn't explain exactly why. The instinct to honk was there, and then it wasn't, replaced by a very specific understanding that honking was not something he should do. That drawing that kind of attention to himself, of announcing himself with sound in that moment, was the wrong kind of action to take. So he sat, and it stood. And after what he estimated was 2 or 3 minutes, it moved. Off the road, to the right, into the tree line. Not quickly, not the way a startled animal moves. Deliberately. With the particular unhurried quality of something that is leaving because it has decided to leave, not because it has been frightened into leaving. And he drove through the space where it had been, and he didn't look into the tree line on the right side as he passed it. He got to work 11 minutes late. He told no one what had made him late. He drove home that evening on the highway. The long way. He told himself it was because he wanted to stop at the hardware store. The hardware store was not on the long way home. He drove home the long way for 3 weeks. And then he went back. He went back because he was stubborn in the particular way that men who have done the same thing the same way for a long time become stubborn about it. Because 11 years of that road had made it his in a way that felt worth defending. Because whatever he had seen that morning had not, technically, done anything, had stood in the road and moved off, had not approached him, had not done anything that a rational man needed to regard as a threat. He told himself these things, and they were true enough to be convincing, and he went back. For a while, it was ordinary again. 2 months into the 11th year, and the road was the road, quiet in its new way, emptied of the wildlife it had once carried, but otherwise behaving the way a road behaves. He relaxed into it the way you relax into a thing when enough time passes without incident. He let his guard down in the specific way that people let their guard down when they need to believe something is fine more than they need to evaluate whether it actually is. and then it started noticing him back. He described it first as a feeling. He was careful to say that because he knew how it sounded, and he wanted to be precise about the sequence of events, about what came first and what followed from it. The feeling came first. The specific, difficult to categorize feeling of being recognized. Not watched. Recognized. The distinction mattered to him. He said it was like the difference between being in a room where someone glances at you and being in a room where someone knows your name. The road, by the 11th year, seemed to know his name. He noticed it on the morning drives first. A quality of attention in the air of the road that wasn't there in the evenings or wasn't as strong in the evenings. As though whatever was there was more alert in the mornings. As though it too had a rhythm, a pattern of wakefulness, and its pattern had after 11 years of overlap begun to synchronize. He drove through it and felt it register him and told himself he was tired. He told himself he was spending too much time alone in a car on a mountain road, and his brain was doing what brains do when they are understimulated, which is find patterns and assign significance to them that isn't there. He told himself all of that and drove, and it kept happening. The second incident was a morning in March. He was 3 miles into the road, in the stretch where the curve was sharpest and the tree line was closest and the headlights were still necessary even though the sun was technically up when the light changed. It happened quickly, not a flicker, not a malfunction, but a change in the quality of the light outside the car, as though something very large had moved between the sun and the road. He looked up. There was no cloud cover. The sky in the gaps between the tree canopy was clear and pale and ordinary. There was no reason for the light to have changed. And yet the road in front of him was different. Darker, but not from shadow. More from the sense that the air itself had shifted density, had become something his headlights were pushing through rather than illuminating. He drove through it slowly. The change lasted for perhaps 30 seconds. And as it ended, as the light returned to what it had been, he saw something in the rearview mirror. Just for a moment. Just in the space between one breath and the next. A shape at the edge of the frame of the mirror, at the very periphery of what the mirror could show him, standing at the side of the road where he had just been. He did not slow down. He drove. He drove, and he kept his eyes forward, and he let the road unspool in front of him, and he breathed through his nose the way his wife had taught him years ago when he'd gone through a period of anxiety that he'd never fully told anyone the reason for. He breathed and drove and arrived at work and sat in the parking lot for 6 minutes before going inside. His coworker asked him if he was all right. He said he was tired. He drove home the long way that evening. He drove home the long way for a month. And then, again, he went back. Because he was stubborn. Because it was his road. Because 19 years of working at the mill and 11 years of that drive had produced in him a relationship with routine that was stronger than most things he'd encountered, and whatever was on that road had not yet done anything to him. Had stood in his road. Had shifted the light around him. Had appeared at the edge of his mirror. Had not touched him. Had not followed him beyond the tree line. And he was stubborn. The last incident was a Wednesday. He remembered the day because Wednesday was the day his daughter called him from college, always around 7 in the evening, and he had been thinking about that call on the drive home. Thinking about what she'd said the week before about a class she was struggling with, about whether he had any useful advice, about how different her world was from his, and how proud that made him in a way he'd never found the words for. He was thinking about his daughter and the call that was coming, and the road was the road, and for one ordinary moment, it was just the drive home. And then it stopped being that. It was the smell first. The same smell Carrie would describe years later. Though he didn't know Carrie, had never met her, would never meet her. The outdoor smell. The deep mountain cold of soil and bark and something beneath both of those things. It filled the car the way a smell fills a space when its source is already inside with you, not drifting in from outside, already present, already established. He looked at the passenger seat. It was empty. He looked in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. He looked back at the road and kept driving. And then the radio changed. Not off. Not static. It changed the way a channel changes when someone else has the remote. The song that had been playing, something from the local country station he kept on for the noise of it, was simply no longer playing. And what replaced it was not music. It was not static. It was a sound that he described to me with a long pause before each word. The way people pause when they are trying to be accurate about something they don't have sufficient language for. He said it was like breathing, but not human breathing. Breathing at the wrong scale. too slow to be anything living in the ordinary sense of living. Long and deep, and with a quality of tremendous age to it. The way a building sounds when it settles, but continuous and rhythmic and deliberate and close. It came from the radio for the remaining 2 miles of the road. He drove those 2 miles with his hands on the wheel and his eyes forward, and the sound filling the car, and not once did he reach for the radio dial. He said he was afraid of what might happen if he interrupted it. He came out the other end of the road. The smell left immediately. The radio returned to the country station mid-song, seamlessly, as though nothing had happened. He drove home. He sat in his driveway for a long time. When his daughter called at 7, he answered on the first ring, and he talked to her for 1 hour and 40 minutes, longer than they had talked in months, longer than the conversation had any reason to be, and he let her voice fill the kitchen, and he did not think about the road. He left the mill at the end of that month. He told his wife he was ready to retire early, that they had enough saved, that he wanted to spend the time differently. She was surprised but not opposed. He took a job 3 years later at a hardware store in town, the one that was not on the long way home, the one that had nothing to do with any road that went into the mountains. He still lives on the eastern slope. He still takes the highway. He has never, in 7 years, driven that road again. Not in the day, not in good weather, not with someone else in the car. He said he'd had enough of it recognizing him, that there was something about being known by a thing that had no business knowing you that changed the way you moved through the world. That made you careful about routes, about rhythms, about the patterns you wore into the world by repetition, because you couldn't be certain, once a thing had learned your shape, that it would ever fully unlearn it. I asked him if he thought it still knew him. If he thought that after 7 years and a different job and a different route it still had any sense of where he was. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said he didn't know, that sometimes, early in the morning, before full light, when he was still in that space between sleeping and waking where the mind is less defended than it is the rest of the day, he had the feeling, the recognition feeling, the sense of something that knew him orienting itself in his direction from a long way away. And then he woke up fully, and it was gone, and the morning was ordinary, and his wife was asleep beside him, and the house was the house. He said it was probably nothing. He said that, and I didn't disagree with him, and we both understood that he didn't believe it. Most of the people who encountered that road did so by accident. They were going somewhere else, and the road was a shortcut, or they were tired and the road was faster, or they were simply from the area, and the road was familiar in the way that things become familiar when you grow up near them without ever fully understanding them. They came to it through ordinary life and ordinary choices, and the road met them there. Owen came to it professionally. He was sent, and that, he would say later, was perhaps the part that disturbed him most. Not what he found on the road, but the fact that someone, somewhere, in some office full of files and records and the accumulated documentation of every road in the state, had sent him there specifically, had looked at a map and seen the gap and decided it needed to be filled in. He spent 3 years after his visit trying to find out who had made that decision. He never did. Owen worked for a state surveying office for 16 years. His job, reduced to its simplest description, was to verify that roads existed in the way that the records said they existed. That a road listed as 2 lanes was 2 lanes. That a road listed as running from point A to point B did in fact run from point A to point B without deviation. That the physical world and the documented world were in agreement. He was, in the most literal sense, a man whose entire professional life was organized around the principle that things should match their descriptions. That the map and the territory should be the same thing. That road was not. He received the assignment on a Thursday morning, passed to him in the same way all his assignments arrived, a printed sheet with a road designation, coordinates, and a description of the documentation gap that needed to be resolved. The description in this case was brief. A section of road, approximately 4 miles in length, running through a stretch of the Appalachian mountain range, had no corresponding construction record in the state archive. Not a lost record, not a misfiled record, an absent one. The road appeared on maps going back further than the records his office maintained. It appeared on maps so old that the surveying conventions used to represent it were different from anything currently in practice. It appeared on all of them, and the record of its construction appeared on none of them. His task was to drive the road, measure it, document its current condition, and note any features of interest that might explain the gap. A gap, His supervisor had said when handing him the sheet, that was almost certainly the result of a filing error in a county office that had since been reorganized twice. Almost certainly. Owen drove up on a Friday, planning to complete the documentation in a single day and drive home that evening. He had a wife and 2 boys and a habit of being home for dinner when the work allowed it. He brought his equipment, his measuring instruments, his camera, his survey forms, his GPS unit, and his laptop loaded with every historical map of the region he'd been able to access in the 2 days between receiving the assignment and leaving for it. He was thorough. He was always thorough. It was the quality his supervisors mentioned in every performance review and the quality his wife said made him an excellent surveyor and a slightly exhausting person to go on vacation with. He drove the highway into the mountains and found the entrance to the road without difficulty. It was marked, after a fashion, by a pale wooden post at the roadside with no signage on it, a post that his GPS confirmed corresponded to the coordinates on his assignment sheet. He pulled over and looked at it for a moment. He took a photograph. He made a note on his form, and then he turned onto the road. The first thing he did, because it was always the first thing he did, was establish a start point. He noted the GPS coordinates. He noted the time. He activated the measuring equipment mounted to the vehicle that would track distance as he drove. He was systematic. He was always systematic. The road itself, in the first mile, was ordinary in every documentable sense. Asphalt surface, weathered but structurally present. Width consistent with a single-lane mountain road, approximately 11 feet at the widest points. Tree line close on both sides. Grade moderate, consistent with the topographical data he'd reviewed. He noted all of it. He photographed at regular intervals, every 1/10 of a mile, the way his training specified. He was doing his job. The irregularities began at the first mile marker, or rather, at the absence of the first mile marker. He'd driven what his measuring equipment confirmed was 1 mile, and there was no marker. This was not, in itself, alarming. Markers on old mountain roads went missing for unremarkable reasons. Vandalism, storm damage, simple administrative neglect. He noted the absence and drove on. The second mile produced no marker either, nor the third. He noted each absence. He kept driving. What he could not note as easily, because his forms had no category for it, was the way the road felt. Not the surface of it, not any measurable physical characteristic, the quality of it. He described it to me as the feeling of driving a road that didn't expect to be driven, not abandoned, not unmaintained in the way a road goes to ruin when nobody uses it, just used in some deeper sense, as though the road had been there for a very long time and nothing had moved along it in a way that left any impression. He said the closest analog he could find was the feeling of opening a room in a house that has been sealed for years, where the air is preserved rather than stale, where nothing has decayed because nothing has been disturbed, because nothing has been present to disturb it. That quality, applied to a road. After a while he started to notice small things. Things that didn't feel wrong at first, just different enough to stay in the back of his mind. The GPS had begun to behave oddly, not failing, not losing signal, just producing readings that didn't match his position in the way they should have. When he stopped the car and compared his GPS coordinates to the historical maps on his laptop, the coordinates placed him approximately 300 feet east of where the road appeared on the maps. He drove forward a 1/4 mile and checked again. The offset was different. Not larger, not smaller, different. As though the relationship between the GPS position and the map position was not consistent but variable, shifting slightly with each measurement in a way that suggested the two systems were not describing the same space. He told himself it was a calibration issue. He told himself the historical maps were imprecise, which was true, which was a reasonable explanation, which he believed enough to keep working. He took more photographs. He completed more survey notes. He was thorough. He was always thorough. And he was trying very hard to stay inside the documented, measurable world of his profession and not think about the way the road felt. The thing that stopped him was the construction marker. He found it at approximately the 3-mile point, set into the tree line on the left side of the road, half consumed by the growth around it, but still legible in the way that old metal markers stay legible long after everything around them has changed. He pulled over and photographed it and climbed out of the car to read it. It was a standard state construction marker of the kind used for road projects through most of the mid-20th century. It had a project number, It had a district code. It had a date. He wrote all of these things down. He thought, looking at the documentation he'd been sent to find. The filing error resolved by a marker in a tree line rather than a folder in an office. He photographed it from 4 angles. He was thorough, and then he looked at the date. The date on the marker was 43 years before the road appeared on the oldest map his office had been able to locate. He stood at the tree line for a long time. He stood there and he looked at the date, and he looked at the project number, and he thought about what those two things meant in relation to each other. A construction marker dated 43 years before the first map showed the road's existence. Not a clerical error in a county office. Something else. Something that didn't have an easy category in the documented, measurable world he lived in professionally. He took 2 more photographs. He got back in the car, and he drove on, because he was thorough, and because the road had 1 more mile to document, and because he had not yet reached the far end of it, and because his forms required documentation of both termination points. The far end of the road, when he reached it, connected to a county highway in a way that was perfectly ordinary. A clean junction, a proper join between surfaces, the kind of connection that implied planning and coordination and a normal construction process. He photographed it. He noted it. He sat there for a while, and then he turned around and drove back. Going back was different from going in. He hadn't expected it to be. The road was the same road. The same 11 feet of weathered asphalt. The same close tree line. The same absence of wildlife, which he had noted on the way in and noted again now. Not a single animal visible. Not a single bird sound. The particular emptied quiet of a place that had been vacated by living things. All of it the same. But the direction was different. And in the different direction, the road felt different. Going in, it had felt unused. Going back, it felt aware. He told himself it was the light. The sun had moved. He'd spent more time on the road than he'd planned, and the angle of the light through the tree canopy was different than it had been on the way in. He told himself that. He drove. He was approximately 2 miles from the entrance when he stopped to photograph a surface feature, a pattern of cracking in the asphalt that his forms required him to document. And when he got back in the car and checked his measuring equipment, he found that his distance from the entrance had changed. Not decreased. Increased. He was, according to the equipment, further from the entrance than he had been 2 minutes earlier, despite having driven toward it. He sat very still for a moment. He checked the equipment twice. He confirmed the reading. He was further from the entrance. He drove, faster than he had been driving. Not panicking, he said, specifically not panicking, because panicking was not something his professional self had much experience with, and he didn't have reliable access to it, even when it might have been appropriate. He drove faster and he watched the distance on the measuring equipment, and it decreased the way distance is supposed to decrease when you are moving toward a fixed point, and he told himself the equipment had malfunctioned and that the malfunction had corrected itself, and that this was the explanation. He believed that for about 40 seconds. And then he saw the marker again, the construction marker, the one he had photographed at the 3-mile point on the way in, half consumed by the tree line on the left side of the road. He was driving away from it, toward the entrance. It should have been behind him. It was not behind him. It was in front of him, on the left side, in the tree line, exactly as it had been. He stopped the car. He sat there with the engine idling, and he looked at the marker, and the marker was where it had always been, and the road behind him was empty, and the road in front of him was the road he'd already driven, and he understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with reasoning and everything to do with the particular stillness that comes over a person when they've run out of explanations, that the road was not behaving the way roads behave. He did not get out of the car to look at the marker again. He drove. Past the marker, past the point where he'd found it, past the 2-mile mark and the 1-mile mark and the absent mile markers and the absent wildlife and the dense, preserved, attended silence of the road. And he drove until the entrance opened in front of him, and he pulled onto the highway and stopped on the shoulder and sat there with the engine running and both hands still on the wheel. He was shaking. He noted this clinically, the way he noted things for his forms. Hands unsteady, breathing elevated. He sat there until the shaking stopped. He drove to a gas station and bought coffee. He sat in the parking lot and opened his laptop and looked at the historical maps again, and the road was there on all of them. Exactly where it had always been, running through the mountain the way it always had, connecting the same 2 points. He looked at the survey forms he'd completed. The photographs, the measurements, everything that was documentable was documented. Everything measurable was measured. His forms were complete. In every category, they had a category for. What they did not have a category for was the construction marker dated 43 years before the road existed. What they did not have a category for was the distance that had increased while he drove toward the entrance. What they did not have a category for was the marker he had passed twice from the same direction on a road with no branches and no turns he hadn't accounted for. He sat in the parking lot for a long time, and then he drove home. He arrived after midnight. His wife was still awake. She asked how it had gone. He said it was fine. He said it was a filing error, probably, the kind of administrative gap that turned out to be nothing when you went and looked at it in person. She said good and brought him tea, and they sat together in the kitchen for a while without talking. He filed his report on Monday. He included everything documentable. He did not include the construction marker. He told himself it was because the date was probably a misread, a weathered digit that looked different from what it actually said, and he didn't have a clear enough photograph to verify it. He told himself that and filed the report without it. His supervisor accepted it. The gap was closed. The file was updated. The road was documented and moved to the category of resolved cases, and Owen went on to his next assignment and the one after that, and continued working for the state surveying office for another 7 years before he retired. He never drove the road again. He looked it up once, about 4 years after the visit, in the updated archive where his own report was now filed. He read through his documentation. He read the measurements and the surface notes and the condition ratings and the photographs he'd taken at intervals. He came to the last photograph, the one he'd taken of the far end of the road, the ordinary junction with the county highway. He had looked at that photograph several times in the years since the visit, and it had always shown what he'd documented: the clean junction, the proper surface join. But on this reading, in the archive, when he opened the final photograph, there was something in it that he didn't remember photographing. Standing at the edge of the frame, at the far right margin of the image, at the boundary between the road and the tree line, was a shape. He had not seen it when he took the photograph. He had not seen it when he reviewed his photographs that evening in the parking lot. It had not been in the image any of the previous times he had looked at it. It was there now, standing at the edge of the frame the way something stands when it knows it's been seen and is deciding whether that changes anything. He closed the file. He requested a different assignment the following day and didn't look at that file again. He told me all of this at a diner in a town near the eastern slope, over the course of 3 hours, on a morning when the mountains were visible from the window and the light was flat and ordinary and the world outside was entirely, unambiguously daytime. He spoke carefully and without embellishment and in the tone of a man who has been precise about language his entire professional life and understands the weight of saying something exactly as it happened. When he finished, he said he didn't know what I intended to do with the account. I said I intended to include it with others. He nodded. He said he supposed that was fine, that it was probably better for it to be out in the world as a story that might or might not be believed than to stay inside him as a thing that was definitely real. I told him I understood. He paid for his coffee and left. I sat there for a while after he'd gone and looked out the window at the mountains and thought about what it means to document a thing, about what it means to make a record of something, about how the entire premise of Owen's profession rested on the assumption that the map and the territory were the same thing, that the world could be described and the description could be trusted, that what was written down and what actually existed were in agreement. There is a road in those mountains that is on every map that has ever been made of that region. It is documented. It is measured. It is in the archive. And somewhere in that archive, in the last photograph of a file that was opened and then closed by a careful and precise man who spent his career making the world match its description, something is standing at the edge of a frame, looking out. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from doing the same work for long enough. Not expertise exactly, though expertise is part of it. Something quieter than expertise. A calibration. A sense for the way things usually go that becomes so refined over enough repetitions that you start to feel the exceptions before you can explain them. Marcus had been doing search and rescue in those mountains for 12 years when the call came in. 12 years of lost hikers and disoriented elderly residents, and the occasional situation that started as one thing and became another. 12 years of following the logic of terrain, of reading the landscape the way experienced people read landscape, not as scenery, but as a set of constraints and possibilities that determined where a missing person was most likely to be. He was good at it. He knew he was good at it not from arrogance, but from the accumulated evidence of 12 years of finding people. He had a sense for where lost things ended up. That sense, in the case he described to me, led him somewhere it had no business leading him. The missing person was a man named Gerald, 61 years old, retired, fit in the careful, deliberate way that people who take up hiking late in life become fit. He'd been doing the mountain trails for 3 years by then, the same rotation of routes, the same careful documentation of his outings in a trail log his daughter had given him as a joke that he'd taken seriously. A responsible hiker in every measurable sense. He'd gone out on a Saturday morning in late September and not come home. His daughter had called the ranger station at 9 that evening when his check-in call hadn't come. By 10:30, the SAR team had their initial briefing. Marcus arrived at the trailhead at 11. He'd done it enough times that the ritual of it was automatic. The gear check, the team coordination, the initial probability assessment based on Gerald's last known position and the routes he favored. Gerald was a creature of habit, his daughter said. He had 3 trails he rotated through, and he almost never deviated from them. This was useful information. This was the kind of information that narrowed a search in practical, concrete ways. Marcus organized the team around the 3 routes, and they went out into the mountain dark with their lights and their radios and the confident purposefulness of people who know their work. He said the first hours were ordinary. The mountain at night was the mountain at night, dark and cold and alive with the particular sounds of a landscape that behaves differently after dark, and the team moved through it with the efficiency that 12 years and 100 searches had produced. They found no sign of Gerald on the first trail. They found no sign of him on the second. By 2 in the morning they were on the 3rd trail, the one his daughter said he'd expressed the most enthusiasm for recently, a route that climbed to a ridge with a long view east, and then descended through a stretch of old-growth forest before looping back to the trailhead. Marcus knew the trail. He'd walked it himself a dozen times in various contexts. He knew where it went and where it didn't go, and the ways that a person moving along it could deviate, and what those deviations typically led to. He knew all of it. And the trail, that night, did not quite match what he knew. He noticed it first in the descent, the old-growth section where the trail wound down through the large trees. He knew this section well enough to walk it with his eyes closed, knew the way the trail bent left around a specific large oak that had come down in a storm 7 years ago and now lay at an angle against its neighbors, knew the way the grade changed after that, knew the particular quality of the footing in the 20 meters after the grade change. He knew all of it. And after the fallen oak the trail bent right, not left. He stopped. He checked his GPS. The coordinates placed him where he expected to be. He looked at the trail. It bent right. He told the team member nearest him that the trail bent left here. The team member looked at the trail and said it looked like it bent right to him. Marcus said nothing more. He went right. He was thorough. He was always thorough. And he'd learned over 12 years that arguing with the physical evidence of your own position was a way of losing searches that you should have found. After a while he started to notice small things. Things that didn't feel wrong at first. Just different enough to stay in the back of his mind. The forest sounded different. Not silent. Not emptied in the way he would come to understand later when thinking back on the other accounts from this mountain. Just different in the specific way that a familiar piece of music sounds different when one instrument is playing a note that doesn't belong. Something in the register of the nighttime sounds around him had shifted, and he couldn't isolate what had shifted, only that the overall texture of the sound was not quite the texture he expected from this particular stretch of forest. He logged it internally the way experienced field people log things they can't categorize. He filed it. He kept moving. The trail came out, after another quarter mile, onto a surface he didn't expect. Asphalt. He stopped at the edge of it. He stood there with his headlamp cutting across the dark surface of an asphalt road, approximately 11 feet wide, bordered by trees on both sides, running in both directions further than his light could reach. He checked his GPS. His team member checked hers. They were, according to every instrument they carried, in a location that did not have a road. He knew, because it was the kind of thing people in his line of work knew about the terrain they operated in, that there was a road somewhere in this mountain range that had an unusual reputation. He knew it the way you know things that circulate through a small community of people who spend a lot of time in specific terrain, without ever having sought the information out, just absorbing it by proximity to others who had. He had never driven it. He had never had professional reason to interact with it. He knew the general location of it. The general location, according to everything he had studied about this terrain over 12 years, was not here. He stood at the edge of the road, and he heard something. Across the road, in the tree line on the other side, a sound that was, unmistakably and immediately, a human voice. Not words. A sound. A low continuous sound that a person makes when they have been making it for a long time, when it has stopped being conscious and become the body's own response to a sustained situation. He crossed the road. He pushed through the tree line on the far side, and he found Gerald. Gerald was sitting at the base of a tree approximately 30 feet from the road, with his back against the bark and his knees drawn up and his arms across them and his head down. He was alive. He was cold and he was dehydrated, and there was a contusion on his left forearm that would need to be looked at, and he was alive. Marcus knelt in front of him and identified himself, and Gerald looked up, and the look on his face was the look Marcus had seen on the faces of found people before, that specific expression that is relief and exhaustion and the slow re-entry of a person into the world they'd temporarily lost access to. That expression was familiar. What was not familiar was what was behind it. Something that didn't belong in the face of a man who had simply been lost overnight. A quality of having been somewhere for longer than overnight. A worn-through quality that Marcus had seen before, but not on people who'd been missing for 10 hours. On people who'd been missing for much longer than that. He got Gerald wrapped and warm. He called the team, and while they waited for the rest of the group to reach them, he stayed with Gerald and let Gerald talk, because talking, in those situations, was what the found needed to do before they needed anything else. Gerald said he'd been following the third trail, the one he always took, and somewhere in the descent through the old-growth section, he'd made a wrong turn. He knew immediately that he'd made a wrong turn. He'd tried to correct it. He tried to work back to the main trail using the basic orienteering principles he'd taught himself in the 3 years since he'd taken up hiking. He was methodical, he said. He'd always been methodical. He worked a grid pattern, marking his positions, trying to find a landmark he recognized. And instead, he found the road. He said he'd come out of the trees onto it and stood there for a while because a road meant something even if you didn't know what road it was, because a road meant that eventually, if you followed it, you'd reach a place where people were. He stood there and oriented himself and decided to follow it. He chose a direction and walked. And he walked for what he estimated was 2 hours. And the road didn't end. He said that calmly. The road didn't end. He walked for 2 hours, he said, and the road continued, and the trees on both sides continued, and no junction appeared, and no sign appeared, and no light appeared from any direction. He turned around and walked back the other way. For another 2 hours, and the road continued, and nothing appeared. He said he checked his phone. He had no signal, which was not unusual in the mountain terrain, but he'd been able to use the phone's compass function, and he'd walked in one direction for 2 hours, and then the opposite direction for 2 hours, and based on the compass readings, he should have covered significant ground, and he should have encountered something. He encountered nothing. He sat down at the edge of the road to rest, and decided to wait for daylight before trying again. He did not recall anything unusual happening while he sat there, he said. He sat at the edge of the road, and the mountain night was the mountain night, and he waited, and he was cold and worried in the measured way of a methodical person who has assessed a bad situation and decided that panic is not a useful response to it. He waited for daylight, and daylight didn't come. He said this the way people say things that they know don't make sense and have given up trying to make sense of. He waited for daylight, and the sky lightened to the particular gray that precedes dawn and then stopped. It did not get darker. It did not get lighter. It stayed in that gray space, that in-between place, for what he estimated was a very long time. Long enough that he stopped trying to estimate it. He moved back into the tree line to get some shelter from the wind, and he sat down against a tree and he waited, and the light did not change, and time did not pass the way time should pass, and he did not sleep, he said, though he was exhausted enough to sleep, because there was something about the gray light and the stillness of the road visible through the trees that made sleep feel inadvisable in a way he couldn't articulate. He waited, and then there were lights in the tree line across the road, and voices, and Marcus found him. Gerald was checked by the medic and assessed as stable, and helped back along the trail to the trailhead where his daughter was waiting. Marcus walked back with the team in the early morning light and thought about what Gerald had described, and thought about the road, and thought about his GPS coordinates, and thought about the way the trail had bent right instead of left, and didn't say anything to any of them. He filed his incident report that afternoon. He included Gerald's account. He included his own GPS data and the discrepancy in trail direction. He did not include his understanding of what road that might have been, because it wasn't information his training had a category for, and incident reports were not documents that accommodated information without categories. The report was filed. Gerald was fine. The case was closed. Marcus went back to the mountain 2 weeks later. He went alone, on a day off, in daylight, because he was thorough, and because the bend in the trail had bothered him, and because 12 years of search and rescue had produced in him an instinct that the discrepancy deserved a second look. He hiked the third trail. He moved through the old-growth section. He came to the fallen oak. The trail bent left. He stood there and looked at the left-bending trail and was not surprised, exactly, and was not reassured, exactly, and continued along it to the point where the trail looped back toward the trailhead. He did not find the road. He checked his GPS at every point where the coordinates seemed relevant. Everything matched. The road was not there. He sat on a rock at the edge of the trail and ate the sandwich he'd packed and looked at the old-growth forest around him and listened to the birds and thought about a man who had walked a road for 4 hours without reaching either end of it and waited in a gray dawn that didn't brighten and was found, eventually, in a patch of trees 30 feet from a road that the GPS said wasn't there. He thought about Gerald's face, about that worn-through quality behind the relief. He'd been thinking about it since the night of the search, and he still couldn't fully account for it. Gerald had been missing for approximately 10 hours. By his own account, he had been on that road for what felt like much longer than 10 hours. Marcus had seen the faces of people who had been missing for multiple days, who had survived in the mountain terrain for periods of time that pushed the body and the mind to the edges of what they could sustain. He knew what that looked like. He knew the specific texture of a person who has spent a very long time in a very hard situation. And Gerald's face, when he found him, had that texture. Not the texture of 10 hours. Not the texture of a cold and worried night in the mountains. The texture of something that had taken much longer. He thought about the gray light. The sky that had lightened to the pre-dawn threshold and stopped. And he thought about what it meant for time to behave differently in one place than it did in the places on either side of it. He didn't have a framework for that. His profession didn't have a framework for that. He finished his sandwich and hiked back down. He called Gerald once, about a month after the search. Gerald sounded fine. He sounded like a man who had been through something and had put it in a category that allowed him to continue his ordinary life without being undone by it. He said he'd gotten back to hiking, shorter trails, day trips, nothing that took him up the eastern slope of the mountain anymore. He said he felt good. Marcus said he was glad to hear it. He asked, carefully, whether Gerald had thought any more about the road. Gerald said he had. He said he'd thought about it quite a bit, actually, in the first weeks afterward. About the 4 hours of walking with no destination reached. About the gray light. About the quality of the time he'd spent there. The way it had felt both very long and somehow directionless, as though it wasn't moving toward anything. He said he'd arrived at an understanding that he couldn't defend rationally, but that felt true to him. He said he thought the road wasn't built to take you anywhere. That it wasn't connected to the places on either side of it the way a normal road was connected to the places on either side of it. That a normal road was a line between 2 points, and the logic of it was the logic of transit, of departure and arrival, of one place giving way to another. And whatever that road was, it wasn't that. It didn't have 2 points. It didn't have a logic of transit. It was something else. A place that presented itself as a road and used the language of roads, the asphalt and the tree line and the directional quality of it, without actually functioning as one. He said he didn't know what that meant. That he'd thought about it as much as he intended to and was moving on. Marcus said he understood and wished him well and hung up. He thought about what Gerald had said for a long time afterward. About a road that wasn't a road. About the difference between a thing that connects and a thing that contains. About what it means to walk in a direction for a very long time and arrive nowhere. He told me this account at a coffee shop near the ranger station where his team operated. He was calm and direct and precise in the way that people who work in emergency services become precise. having learned the value of saying things accurately in situations where accuracy matters. When he finished, he said he'd told the story twice before, both times to people in his field, both times received with the polite skepticism that sensible people bring to things that don't fit their professional frameworks. He said he understood the skepticism. He said he still had it himself, about parts of it, about the parts that were furthest from anything his experience had given him a category for. But not about the face. Not about what Gerald's face looked like when he found him. About that he had no skepticism at all. He said that was the thing that stayed with him most. Not the road, and not the GPS, and not the gray light that wouldn't brighten. The face of a man who had been missing for 10 hours, but had spent much longer than that somewhere. And the specific, careful way that Gerald had looked at him in that first moment of being found. Not just with relief. With the look of someone who had stopped being entirely certain that anyone was coming. Who had waited in the gray light long enough to begin to wonder whether the world that had roads and trails and search teams and daughters waiting at trailheads was still available to him. Whether it was something he could still return to, or whether he had crossed some threshold that made return the kind of thing you could no longer assume. Marcus said he'd found a lot of people in 12 years. He'd seen a lot of faces at the moment of being found. He knew the different textures of that moment. The pure relief. The physical collapse of the body when the crisis ends. The particular emotional openness of a person who has been afraid for a long time and is suddenly not afraid anymore. He'd seen all of it. And what Gerald's face had, underneath all of those things, was something he'd seen exactly once before and hoped not to see again. He didn't tell me when he'd seen it before. I didn't ask. Some things that pass between people in conversations like that one are better left where they are. He finished his coffee. He looked out the window at the mountain range visible from the coffee shop, the long blue ridge of it in the afternoon light, entirely ordinary from this distance, entirely the thing it had always appeared to be. He said he still worked those trails, that he'd covered every route on that mountain at least a dozen times in the years since Gerald, that he'd never found the road again, that sometimes, in the old-growth section of the third trail, near the fallen oak that had lain at its angle against its neighbors for 7 years, he felt something that wasn't quite a sound and wasn't quite a presence, but was the specific feeling of a threshold nearby, of something on the other side of the ordinary. He said when he felt it, he kept moving, that he marked the position and kept moving and didn't look too long at anything that wasn't the trail in front of him. He said it was the same instinct he'd had at the road when he'd called his team and waited with Gerald and not asked too many questions about the face or the gray light or the 4 hours of walking that went nowhere. The instinct to bring the found person back and not linger. To treat the threshold as a thing to move through rather than a thing to examine. To understand that some places have their own rules about who they give back and who they keep. And to not spend more time in them than the job required. He stood up and shook my hand and left. I sat there for a while after he'd gone. I thought about thresholds. About the particular kind of place that presents itself as a passage but isn't one. About a road that uses the language of transit and the logic of connection while functioning as neither. About a man who walked it for 4 hours in one direction and arrived nowhere. About the gray light that held at the edge of dawn and didn't move. About what it means to wait in a place like that long enough to begin to doubt that the world on the other side of it is still there. These accounts have taken me a long time to collect. I have driven that mountain more times than I'm comfortable admitting, always in daylight, always on the highway, always with the window down and the radio on and the ordinary noise of the ordinary world keeping me company. I have never found the road from the highway. I have never turned down a narrow asphalt lane and seen the tree line close on both sides and felt the air in the car change. And I've thought about that. About what it means that some people find the road and some people don't. Whether it's random, whether it's the time of day or the direction you're traveling or the particular quality of exhaustion you're carrying when you pass the entrance. Or whether the road finds people. Whether it recognizes something in certain travelers that makes them legible to it in a way others aren't. Whether 11 years of the same commute can make you visible to a thing that notices patterns. Whether the careful, precise mind of a surveyor looking for a gap in the record is exactly the kind of attention such a place might want turned toward it. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think any of the people whose accounts I've collected know the answer to that either. What they know is what happened to them on one particular stretch of mountain road. What they know is the cold in the car, and the shape in the passenger seat, and the marker that shouldn't have existed, and the distance that increased when it should have decreased, and the gray light that held at dawn. What they know is the face of a man who had spent much longer than 10 hours somewhere that has its own rules about time. What they know is that some roads aren't roads, and that the difference between a road and a thing that looks like a road is very difficult to determine until you're already on it. There is a county historical archive in a town at the base of the eastern slope that most people don't know exists. It occupies the second floor of a municipal building that was built in the 1940s and has the particular smell of all buildings from that era that have been used continuously since. A smell of old paper and cleaning solution, and the accumulated presence of a great many people conducting a great many types of ordinary business over a very long time. The archive itself is 2 rooms. One room has shelves. The other room has a table for chairs and a window that looks out over the parking lot and, beyond the parking lot, the beginning of the mountain range. Eleanor has worked in that archive for 19 years. She came to it with a graduate degree in regional history and a specific interest in the settlement patterns of mountain communities, in the ways that people moved through and established themselves in terrain that resisted habitation, in the documentary record of those movements. She came to it for professional reasons and stayed for the same reason people stay in archive work, which is that the archive kept having more in it than she expected, and the questions it raised kept being more interesting than the questions it answered. And she found, over 19 years, that she had developed a relationship with the accumulated record of that particular region that felt less like a professional skill and more like a kind of intimacy. She knew that archive the way you know a person you have spent a very long time with. Its habits, its gaps, its particular silences. When something in it was wrong, she felt it before she could explain it. She felt it the day she found the first map. It came to her as donations often came to the archive, without announcement and with minimal context, in a box left at the front desk of the building downstairs by an elderly man whose connection to the materials inside it he explained briefly and unclearly before leaving. She brought the box upstairs and opened it, and found what appeared to be a collection of documents from the estate of a former county surveyor, most of it unremarkable, the kind of accumulation that happens when a person spends a professional lifetime in a field and no one goes through their files carefully before those files are passed on. Surveys and field notes and correspondence, all of it from the mid-20th century, and most of it already duplicated in the archive in some form. She set aside most of the box for cataloging and was nearly to the bottom of it when she found the map. It was folded, not rolled, which was itself unusual for a map of its scale, and the folds had left white lines across the image where the paper had been pressed for a very long time. She unfolded it carefully on the table and weighted its corners with the small, smooth stones she kept for that purpose and looked at it. It was a topographical map of the mountain range, hand-drawn, using a system of representation she recognized as belonging to a surveying tradition that had been standardized in the region in the late 19th century. The paper was consistent with that era. The ink was consistent with that era. She had handled enough documents from that period to know the difference between genuine age and manufactured age, and this was genuine. And on it, running through the eastern slope of the mountain range in a way that matched the terrain precisely, was the road. She knew about the road. She knew about it the way Eleanor knew about most things in that county's history, which was thoroughly and with documentation. She knew the accounts that had circulated through the community over the decades, the stories that people told about it with varying degrees of seriousness and varying degrees of detail, the reputation it had acquired among the kind of people who paid attention to such reputations. She knew it was real because she had cross-referenced its location in the state archive and found it documented, measured, categorized, and assigned a file number by a surveyor whose report she had read. She had never driven it. She had never had professional reason to interact with it directly. She had, in 19 years of working in a building that looked out at the mountains, thought about it occasionally and moved on. And now she was looking at it on a map that was, by every material indicator she could assess, from the late 19th century. A map drawn 30 years before the construction marker Owen had found in the tree line. A map drawn more than 70 years before the road appeared in any state record. She weighted the corners of the map and sat down at the table and looked at it for a long time. She looked at it the way she looked at all things in the archive that didn't immediately fit the record she understood, which was carefully and without the assumption that she already knew what she was looking at. She examined the surveying conventions used to represent the road. She examined the representation of the surrounding terrain and compared it, from memory and then from reference, to the topographical record she knew. The surrounding terrain was accurate. Accurately drawn in the conventions of the period, accurately positioned relative to the landmarks she could identify, accurately consistent with the physical reality of the mountain range as it was documented in every other source she had access to. The surrounding terrain was right, and in the middle of it, the road. She photographed the map. She made notes. She filed it in a preservation sleeve and began, the following morning, the process she began whenever the archive produced something that didn't immediately fit, which was to look for the context that would make it fit. She started with the provenance. The man who had left the box had given his name to the front desk, and she had it on the donation form, and she spent 2 days trying to contact him before concluding that the address he'd written down did not correspond to any residence in the county. She turned to the surveyor whose estate the box purportedly represented. She found him in the record. A county surveyor active from the 1920s through the 1950s, reasonably well documented in the archive and other contexts. A man whose professional life she could trace through correspondence and field reports and departmental records. She found no reference in any of his documented work to the map she'd found in the box. She found no reference to the road. She found no reference to the eastern slope surveys that the map's conventions implied. She found, in other words, a gap in the record of a man whose record she could otherwise construct with reasonable completeness. She was familiar with gaps. Gaps were part of archive work. Gaps were what happened when records were lost, or misfiled, or never created in the first place, or created and then deliberately removed. She had seen all of those varieties of gap in 19 years. But after a while she started to notice small things. Things that didn't feel wrong at first, just different enough to stay in the back of her mind. The gap in the surveyor's record was not like the other gaps she knew. Most gaps were inert. An absence where a record should be is simply an absence, a hole in the pattern, something missing without intention. This gap had a different quality. She became aware of it gradually. Over the weeks, she spent working through the surveyor's record looking for references to the eastern slope. The awareness was not something she could have put on a form. It was the feeling that the gap was deliberate. Not the absence of a record that had never been created, but the absence of a record that had been removed. She had seen deliberate gaps before. They had a particular shape. The record on either side of them was too tidy. The correspondence that surrounded the missing period was too smooth, too continuous, with none of the rough edges that indicated a genuine transition between documented events. She'd seen it in personal correspondence from estates where someone had clearly gone through the letters before donating them. She'd seen it in organizational records from institutions with complicated histories. The records around the surveyor's work on the eastern slope had that quality. Too smooth, too continuous, as though the transition between one period and another had been managed. She did not say this in any official communication about the map. She noted it privately and continued working. The second map came from a different source. She had placed a quiet inquiry with 2 regional archives further north, asking whether they held any 19th century survey materials for the eastern slope of the mountain range, framing it as routine cross-referencing in the way that regional archivists cross-reference with each other. It took 3 weeks for the response to come, and when it did it was brief. One of the archives, a small institutional collection attached to a historical society that occupied a renovated farmhouse outside a town she'd visited once for a conference, had a single item that matched her description. They sent a photograph. The map was older than the one she'd found in the box. The paper, even in the photograph, had the texture of significant age, the kind of age that meant early 19th century at the most recent and possibly earlier. The surveying conventions were different, older, belonging to a tradition that predated standardization, the kind of hand-drawn cartographic work produced by individuals rather than by institutional surveying programs. The terrain representation was rougher than the later map, less precise in its topographical detail, using a notation system she recognized from her study of early regional settlement documentation. And on it, in the early notation system of a tradition that predated the systematic surveying of that mountain range, was the road. She sat with the photograph for a very long time. She thought about what it meant to find a road on a map from a period when the road's terrain had not yet been formally surveyed, when the systematic documentation of that mountain region had not yet begun, when the people with the institutional capacity to build a road of that specification in that terrain were not yet present in the region in any number that made it possible. She thought about these things, and she thought about the construction marker dated 43 years before the state's earliest map record, and she understood that she was not dealing with a filing error or an administrative gap. She was dealing with something that had been on that mountain longer than the record admitted. She contacted the Historical Society with the second map. She asked about its provenance. The response came back after 10 days, from the Society's director, a retired academic who wrote with the careful precision of someone choosing words for a specific reason. The map, he wrote, had been part of their collection since the Society's founding in the 1930s. It had been donated at that time by the estate of a family whose name he included, a family that had been among the earliest European settlers in the region, arriving in the late 18th century. The map had been listed in the Society's catalog since the founding, categorized as a regional curiosity, a piece of early cartographic work of uncertain provenance and unknown authorship. He said they had never been able to establish who had drawn it, that the cartographic style did not match any identified surveyor or mapping tradition from the early settlement period, that the level of accuracy in the terrain representation was inconsistent with the period's typical survey capabilities, more accurate than it should have been for its apparent age, which was one of the reasons it had always been categorized as a curiosity rather than as a primary historical document. He said he was glad someone was taking an interest in it. He sounded, in the careful precision of his letter, slightly relieved. She drove to the Historical Society on a Saturday in November. She brought her camera and her notes and the photograph of the first map and the documentation she'd assembled about the road's appearance in the state record. She spent 4 hours with the second map, examining it under magnification, comparing its terrain representation to the first map, to the state survey documents, to the physical reality of the mountain range as she understood it from 2 decades of working with its documentary record. The accuracy was remarkable, not just consistent with the terrain, remarkably consistent. The road on the second map ran through the mountain at an angle and elevation and with a precision of position that matched the first map exactly. That matched the state record exactly. That matched, she had no doubt, the physical road that existed in those mountains. Drawn in a cartographic style that had no identified author, at a level of accuracy that exceeded the period's typical survey capability, at a time when the institutional and technological capacity for its construction was not present in the region. She photographed everything and drove home. She sat with all of it for several weeks. She returned to the archive each day and did her ordinary work, and in the hours between tasks, she returned to the maps and what they implied. She was not a person who went quickly to extraordinary explanations. 19 years of archive work had given her a deep and functional appreciation for the mundane explanations that, in the end, accounted for most anomalies in the documentary record: misdating, misattribution, deliberate or accidental misfiling. The simple fact that the past was imperfectly recorded and the gaps in the record invited the imagination to fill them with things that weren't there. She had seen all of those explanations prove correct more times than she could count. She wanted one of them to prove correct here. But after a while, the thing she noticed was not in the maps at all. It was in the archive's own catalog. She found it while cross-referencing the donation records, looking for any other materials from the same estate that had produced the first map. The archive maintained a catalog of all donations received since its founding, a document she knew intimately, a document she had worked with and contributed to for 19 years. She knew its structure. She knew its handwriting, the succession of hands that had maintained it over the decades, the way the cataloging conventions had changed and then standardized and then changed again. She knew it the way you know a document you have read hundreds of times. And there was an entry in it she had never seen before. She noticed it because it was in the wrong hand for its position. The entries around it were from the 1980s, written in the neat institutional hand of the director who had run the archive in that decade. The entry itself was in a hand she didn't recognize, older than the surrounding entries, written in the kind of ink that aged differently than the ballpoint pens of the 1980s, sitting in the middle of the catalog in a position where it shouldn't have been, surrounded by entries it didn't belong among. It was a donation record from 1961, a single item described as a set of field survey notes pertaining to the Eastern Slope Road Survey, donated by the estate of the county surveyor, the same county surveyor whose estate had produced the box left at the front desk, the same gap in whose professional record she had been finding too smooth, too continuous, too carefully managed. Field survey notes pertaining to the Eastern Slope Road Survey. She checked the archive's physical holdings. She knew the holdings well enough to know where materials from 1961 donations were stored, in the section of shelving organized by decade of acquisition. She went to the shelf. She looked at the materials from that year and found, in the position where the donation record indicated the field notes should be, a folder that was thicker than its neighbors and slightly different in color, the particular faded quality of a folder that had been there for a long time and not disturbed. She brought it to the table. She sat down. She opened it. The notes were handwritten, 43 pages of them, in a compact and precise hand that she would later match, through comparison with other documents from his career, to the county surveyor. They were dated across a span of 3 weeks in the autumn of 1938. They described, in the systematic and unsentimental language of survey work, a comprehensive documentation of the Eastern Slope Road, its surface, its dimensions, its grade, its relationship to the surrounding terrain. The notes were thorough. They were the notes of a thorough man. She read through them carefully over the following 2 hours and found nothing in them that contradicted the state record, nothing that explained the first map or the second map, nothing that accounted for the construction marker dated before any map showed the road's existence. And then she reached the final pages. The final pages were different from the rest in tone, but not in handwriting. Same hand, same pen, same compact and precise notation. But the language had changed from the unsentimental documentation of measurements and surface conditions to something else. Something that she read twice and then a third time, not because she hadn't understood it on the first reading, but because understanding it required a moment of stillness that the first reading didn't allow for. He had tried to find where the road began. He described this as the final phase of the survey, a standard practice for documentation of this type, to identify the origin point of the road, the place where construction had begun. He had driven the road from its junction with the county highway back toward the western entrance, looking for the characteristics that typically indicated an origin point, the change in road surface that signaled the beginning of a construction project, the particular way that older asphalt met the terrain at a project starting point, slightly thicker at the edge, slightly less certain in its integration with the surrounding land. He knew what he was looking for. He drove the road in the early morning, in the autumn, in the particular low light of that season that showed surface characteristics more clearly than the flat light of midday. He drove it, and the road did not begin. He described this plainly, with the same notational precision he had used for the measurements and surface conditions. He had driven the road from the eastern junction toward the western entrance, a distance of 4 miles, and at the western entrance the road simply ended at the junction with the highway. There was no origin point. There was no beginning of construction, no change in surface, no characteristic thickening at the edge that indicated where the road met the terrain for the first time. The road arrived at the western junction with the same surface quality, the same integration with the surrounding land, the same completeness that it had everywhere else. It arrived at the highway the way a sentence arrives at a period, without beginning. He drove it 3 more times over the following 2 days, always from the eastern junction westward, always looking for the thing that should have been there and wasn't. On the 3rd day, he stopped the car in the middle of the road at approximately the 2-mile mark and sat with the engine off and wrote his final notes. He wrote that he had been surveying roads in this region for 14 years, that he understood the physical logic of road construction and the documentary evidence that accompanied it, and the physical evidence that remained in a road's surface long after construction was complete. That he had never encountered a road that did not have a beginning. That a road without a beginning was, by every principle of his understanding of roads, not possible. That a road was a human project, and human projects began somewhere, and the evidence of that beginning persisted in the physical record of the project for as long as the project existed. And then he wrote something that was not in the language of survey notes at all. He wrote that he had been sitting in his car at the 2-mile mark for approximately 20 minutes, that the road was quiet, That the tree line was close on both sides, and the morning light was the particular low light of autumn, and the mountains were visible through the windshield the way the mountains were visible on any clear morning in that season. And that in the 20 minutes he had been sitting there, he had become increasingly aware that the road was aware of him. He wrote that he understood this to be an irrational observation. That he was a surveyor and not a man given to irrational observations, and that he was recording it precisely because it was irrational, and he wanted there to be a record of something irrational having happened to him in the course of what had been an otherwise methodical and rational body of work. He wrote that the awareness was specific, not the general unease of a person in an unfamiliar place, not the vague discomfort of an isolated location. Specific, the sense of being oriented to, of being the object of a focused and sustained attention that was coming from the road itself. From the asphalt under his tires and the tree line on both sides and the air of the place, all of it organized, in some way he could not describe with the language he had for describing things, around the fact of his presence. He wrote that he started the car and drove out of the Eastern Junction without stopping and filed his report and did not include those final notes in the filed version, that he intended to keep them separately and that he had no particular idea what to do with them. He did not write anything after that. Eleanor sat at the table with the final pages for a long time. She thought about a man sitting in his car on a road that had no beginning, in the low autumn light of 1938, writing down something irrational because he wanted there to be a record of it. She thought about the two maps, about the catalog entry in the wrong hand, about the field notes sitting in their folder for 60 years undisturbed on a shelf she had passed thousands of times. She thought about what it meant that he had kept these notes separate, that he had sent them, ultimately, to this archive, to this shelf, to this folder, whether intentionally or as part of an estate that moved his papers without knowing what was among them, whether he had wanted them found, whether he had wanted there to be a record of something irrational having happened to him, in the way that the found people in the other accounts seemed to want there to be a record, want someone to know the specific texture of what had occurred, want the thing that had happened to them to exist somewhere outside of themselves. She copied the final pages. She returned the folder to its position on the shelf. She drove home. She has continued to work in the archive in the years since. She has not found any additional materials related to the road. She has not looked for them. She told me, when I sat with her in the archives table room on an afternoon when the light from the window was flat and gray and the mountains were obscured by cloud, that she considered the research closed, that she had found what she was going to find, and that continuing to look for more of it felt, to her, like the wrong kind of attention to be paying to something that had already demonstrated a specific interest in the kind of attention people paid to it. She said she thought about the surveyor sitting in his car at the 2-mile mark, about the distinction between conducting a survey and being surveyed, about how his entire professional life had been organized around the first, and how he had found himself, on a quiet autumn morning in the mountains, experiencing the second. She said she thought that was important, that the distinction mattered, that there was a specific kind of vulnerability in being the person who looks carefully at a thing, who documents it, who builds a record of it, who makes themselves, through the sustained application of attention, fully visible to the thing they're studying. She said she did not think about the road often, that when she did it was usually in the context of that distinction, of looking and being looked at, of the way that 19 years in an archive had produced in her a set of habits around deep and careful attention to things that resisted easy understanding, and the particular risk that attached to those habits when the thing being examined had demonstrated, across a body of evidence that she could not dismiss, that it noticed the people who noticed it. She said she hoped the surveyor had eventually made peace with what had happened to him on the road, that his notes had the quality of a man trying to be precise about something he was not at peace with, that there was a kind of loneliness in what he'd written in those final pages. A man alone in a car on a road that shouldn't exist, writing down something irrational in careful and systematic language, knowing that no one would read it in any context where it could be verified, knowing that the filed report in the county office had none of it, and the version that had all of it was sitting in his car and would sit in his files and would eventually sit in a box that would eventually sit on a shelf in an archive, where it waited for 60 years for someone to find it. She said she thought about him sometimes, on the quiet days in the archive, when the building was empty and the light from the parking lot window was the low light of a season changing. She thought about what he'd wanted when he'd kept those notes. Whether he'd wanted vindication, wanted someone to eventually read them and confirm that what he had experienced was real. Whether he'd wanted absolution, wanted to have recorded it so that it existed somewhere outside of him and he could put it down. Or whether he'd simply wanted a witness. Someone to sit with the record of an irrational thing that had happened to a rational man on a road with no beginning, and not dismiss it, and not require it to be more explicable than it was, and let it stand as what it was, which was a true account of a thing that had happened, which was all any of these accounts were, in the end. True accounts of things that had happened, collected by a person who drove a highway past the mountain on the way home, with the window down and the radio on and the ordinary world keeping company, and had not yet found the road, and was no longer certain whether that meant the road had not found her. The archive closes at 5. She was there when I arrived, and she was there when I left, at the table by the window in the second room, with the mountains somewhere behind the cloud cover and the parking lot ordinary below her, and the record of the county stretching back around her on its shelves. Everything documented. Everything in its folder. Everything where it was supposed to be. The field notes on the shelf where they had always been. The catalog entry in the wrong hand in its wrong position. The 2 maps in their preservation sleeves. All of it there. All of it waiting for the specific quality of attention that makes a thing visible. All of it very, very patient. I want to be precise about what happened. I have spent a long time with these accounts, and I know how easy it is to let the shape of a story pull the facts of an experience into a form that is more narratively satisfying than it is accurate. I know how memory works on the things that happen to us in states of fear or confusion, smoothing them, selecting from them, making them cohere in ways they didn't cohere at the time. I know all of that. I am going to try to tell this the way it happened, not the way it feels in retrospect, not the way it wants to be told, the way it actually was, in the order it actually occurred, with as much precision as I can bring to something that resisted, at every point, my attempts to be precise about it. I had been driving the highway past the mountain for 2 years by the time this happened. Not always. Not every day. But often enough that the drive had become familiar in the way that drives become familiar. The particular sequence of landmarks and grade changes and views that your body learns before your mind does. So that you make the turns and adjustments without thinking about them. So that the drive asks very little of your attention after a while and your attention goes elsewhere. I had been driving it to conduct interviews. To sit in diners and coffee shops and archive rooms and listen to accounts that I then drove home with, turning them over on the highway the way you turn an object in your hands to understand its dimensions. I had driven past the mountain a very large number of times by the night I'm describing. I had driven past the entrance to the road a very large number of times. I knew, approximately, where the entrance was. I had looked for it on the drives, sometimes, in the way you look for something you're not sure you want to find, without fully committing your attention to the search. I had never found it from the highway. I had come to understand, through the accounts of the people I'd spoken to, that this was not unusual, that the road was not always visible from the highway, that it was not always available to be found, that some people found it, and some people didn't, and the determining factor, if there was one, was not something that submitted to analysis in the way most determining factors did. I had thought about that often. About what it would mean to be the kind of person the road found. About whether the collection of these accounts, the sustained and documented attention I had paid to the road over 2 years, had made me that kind of person, or whether I had always been that kind of person and the attention was the evidence of it rather than the cause. It was a Tuesday in late October. I was driving home from the archive, from the last of my conversations with Eleanor, later than I had planned because the conversation had gone longer than I expected, and the light had been gone from the sky for some time before I got on the highway. I had the window down. I had the radio on. I had the ordinary world keeping company the way it always did on that drive. I was not looking for the road. I want to be clear about that. I was not, on that particular night, conducting any deliberate search. I was driving home on a familiar highway and thinking about Eleanor and the surveyor's notes and the catalog entry in the wrong hand, the way I always thought on that drive. The same material turning over in the same way it always turned. I wasn't looking for anything, and I saw the entrance. It appeared on the right side of the highway the way things appear when you're not looking for them, suddenly and completely, without any sense of having almost seen it or approached it or passed close to it before actually seeing it. A pale wooden post at the roadside, a narrow asphalt lane beyond it, disappearing into the dark between the trees. I knew what it was immediately. I had known for 2 years what it looked like and where it approximately was, and I knew it immediately and completely in the moment I saw it. The way you recognize a person you know from a great distance before you can identify the specific features that make them recognizable. I pulled over. I sat on the shoulder of the highway with the engine running and the radio on and the window down and looked at the post and the lane beyond it. I sat there for what I think was a long time. I thought about all of them. About the woman who had stopped because she was tired and the road had seemed familiar and something about it hadn't felt right until much later. About the truck driver who had pulled down a shortcut and found the weight of the air in his cab change before he understood what he'd turned onto. About the commuter who had taken the same road for 11 years, every morning, until the morning it wasn't the road he knew anymore. About the surveyor standing at the tree line reading a date that couldn't be right. About Marcus walking a trail that bent the wrong way, finding a man whose face held something that didn't belong to 10 hours. About Eleanor in her archive room, sitting with a folder that had been on a shelf for 60 years, reading the final notes of a man who had sat in his car at the 2-mile mark and understood that the attention was no longer only going in one direction. I thought about all of it. I thought about it for as long as I sat on the shoulder. And then I turned onto the road. I want to say that the decision was deliberate, was made from a position of clarity, was the outcome of a rational process that weighed what I knew and what I was choosing. I want to say that because it would be more comfortable than the truth, which is that the decision was made in the same way that certain decisions are made, below the level of deliberation, in the part of a person that has already arrived at something before the thinking mind catches up. I had collected these accounts for 2 years. I had been, in some sense, working toward this for 2 years. The thinking part of me had always believed that I might never find the road. Had constructed a version of the project in which finding the road was not necessary, in which the accounts were sufficient, in which the testimony of the people who had been on the road was the thing and my own experience was beside the point. That part of me had been, I understood as I turned onto the road, wrong. The first thing I noticed was the radio. Not that it stopped working, that it kept working, that the signal that should have degraded in the mountain terrain, that had degraded on every drive through that area at that time of night, held. Clear and continuous. Ordinary music on an ordinary station, playing without interruption, as though the terrain were not there. I noticed it, and I noted it, and I kept driving. The road was what I had expected from the accounts. 11 feet of weathered asphalt. Tree line close on both sides. The particular quality of a road that didn't announce itself, that existed in a register slightly below the register of roads that wanted to be noticed. I drove slowly. I had my headlights on and the window still down and the radio still playing, and I drove the way you drive when you're trying to pay attention to everything at once and haven't yet learned which things are worth paying attention to. After a while, I started to notice small things. Not the road itself. Not any physical characteristic I could have put in a survey form. The silence outside the car. The silence under the radio, underneath it, present even when the music was present. The particular quality of a silence that existed in the same space as sound without being displaced by it. The animals had stopped. Not that I had been hearing animals before and then stopped hearing them. I became aware, gradually, that I had not heard a single animal sound since turning onto the road, and that this was a different kind of quiet from the quiet of a late October night in the mountains, which is never fully quiet, which always has something moving in it, something alive and present at the edges of what you can hear. This had nothing at the edges. It had nothing in it at all except the music on the radio and the sound of my tires on the asphalt, and, underneath both of those things, the deep and complete quiet of a place that had asked everything else to leave. I drove 1 mile. I drove 2 miles. I pulled over at approximately the 2-mile mark and stopped the car and sat for a moment and thought about the surveyor, at this same position, in 1938, writing in the careful language of his profession about something that his profession had no language for. I thought about what he had written, about the orientation, about the sense of being the object of a focused attention. I sat in the car and I waited to feel it. I did not feel it immediately. What I felt first was the cold. The window was still down and the October air was the October air of those mountains at night, which is cold in the specific way of high terrain in late autumn, a cold with weight to it, the kind that settles on you rather than surrounding you. I felt it, and I was going to put the window up, and I stopped with my hand on the button because something had changed in the quality of the air. Not the temperature, not a sound, a quality. Something I could not name then and cannot name now in any language that doesn't sound like the language the other accounts had used, which were all various attempts to describe the same thing, the same shift, the same moment when the ordinary road became something other than a road, and the person driving it became something other than a person who was simply going somewhere. I became aware of the road. I know how that sounds. I had been on the road for 20 minutes. I had been aware of it in the ordinary sense, the sense in which you are aware of the surface beneath your wheels and the space on either side of you and the direction you are traveling. I had been aware of it that way since turning off the highway. What changed at the 2-mile mark was different. I became aware of the road the way you become aware of a room when you realize there is someone else in it. Not a sight or a sound. A shift in the quality of the space itself. A reorganization of the darkness around the car that was not about the darkness changing, but about understanding, suddenly and completely, that the darkness was organized, that it had a center, that the center was the car, that the car, and the person in it, was what the road was currently paying attention to. I sat very still. The radio played. The music was something ordinary, something I had heard many times, and the familiarity of it was, in that moment, the most important thing I had access to. I held on to it. I held on to the ordinary music on the ordinary radio the way you hold on to something when the ground under you has shifted and you're trying to determine whether it will settle or keep moving. It settled. The road was still there. The car was still there. The headlights were still cutting across the asphalt in the ordinary way of headlights on an ordinary road. Everything was physically exactly as it had been. And underneath all of that, in the register that the surveyor's notes had tried to describe and failed in the same way I was failing now, the road was aware of me. I thought about what Eleanor had said, about the difference between looking and being looked at, about the specific vulnerability of the person who pays careful attention to a thing, who documents it, who makes themselves visible to it through the sustained application of noticing. I had spent 2 years paying careful attention to this road. I had collected 7 accounts. I had sat with each of the people who had been on the road, and I had listened to them, and I had tried to understand what they had experienced, and I had made of their experiences a record, had given them form and language and structure, and made them into something that could be held and examined and thought about. And in doing all of that, I had made myself, as Eleanor had said, visible, fully and specifically visible, to a thing that noticed the people who noticed it. I sat at the 2-mile mark for a long time, and then I did the thing that I had known, somewhere below deliberation, was the thing I had come to do. I turned the radio off. I put the window up, and I sat in the silence of the road, and I let it look at me. This is the part that I find most difficult to describe accurately, because description requires language, and language requires categories, and what happened in the silence of the car at the 2-mile mark of a road that existed on maps going back further than anyone could explain did not submit to categories in any way that I could later reconstruct. What I can say is what it wasn't. It wasn't frightening, in the way that fear is a response to a threat you can locate and orient yourself toward. It wasn't peaceful, in the way that peace is the absence of disturbance. It was something that had elements of both and the full quality of neither, the way that very old places sometimes have a quality that isn't comfortable and isn't uncomfortable, but is simply very much itself, simply very much there, in a way that makes you aware of your own presence as a recent and temporary thing. I thought about the woman who had found the road because it had seemed familiar, about what kind of familiarity that might have been, whether it was the familiarity of a place you had been before or the familiarity of a thing you had always known in some part of yourself that was older than knowing. I thought about the truck driver and the weight of the air in the cab and the shape in the passenger seat that had looked like his daughter, whether the road had shown him something of his own or whether it had constructed something from the material of what he carried. I thought about the commuter who had driven the same road for 11 years without finding it and then found it so completely that the ordinary version of it became inaccessible to him, whether the repetition had made him visible or whether he had always been visible, and it had taken 11 years of proximity for the road to turn its attention fully toward him. I thought about the surveyor at this same spot, writing in careful language about something his language couldn't hold, keeping the final pages separate because he understood that the version of events that went into the official record needed to remain in the category of the documentable, and what had happened to him at the 2-mile mark was not in that category, and perhaps never would be. I thought about Marcus finding Gerald in the tree line, 30 feet from a road that the GPS said wasn't there, with a face that held the texture of something much longer than 10 hours. About what it meant to be in a place that had its own relationship with time. About what the gray light at the edge of dawn felt like when it held and didn't brighten, when the threshold of morning became a place you could be suspended in, neither night nor day, neither lost nor found, neither fully in the world you'd left nor fully in whatever this was. I thought about Eleanor and the field notes sitting in their folder for 60 years, and the catalog entry in the wrong hand, and the surveyor who had wanted a witness, who had kept the final pages because he couldn't not keep them, because the alternative was to let the experience exist only inside himself, which was its own kind of being lost. All of these things moved through me in the silence of the car at the 2-mile mark. They moved through me, and I let them, and the road was present the way it had been present since I turned the radio off, and I was present in the way I had not been on any of the drives along the highway in 2 years of driving it. Fully present, without the ordinary distance of the collector, the interviewer, the person assembling other people's experiences into a record, without the glass of that distance between me and what I was trying to understand. And in that presence, without the distance, I understood something that I had not been able to understand from any of the accounts individually or from all of them assembled together. The road was not malevolent. This seems like a simple thing. It seems like the kind of reassurance a person tells themselves when they are in a frightening place and need to believe the place is not hostile. I want to be precise. It was not reassurance. It was not something I told myself. It was something I understood, in the specific way you understand things that arrive without argument, without the process of being convinced. The road was not malevolent, and it was not benevolent. It was not organized around human experience in any way that made the categories of malevolent and benevolent applicable. Those categories described orientations toward human welfare, toward the experience of the people who moved through a place and what the place wanted for them or wanted to do to them. And the road was not oriented toward human experience in that way. It was not oriented toward human experience at all. It was something much older than human experience, and its relationship to the people who found it, or who it found, was the relationship of a very old thing to a very recent thing, the particular quality of attention that immensity pays to the brief and the passing, which is not cruelty and is not kindness, but is a form of noticing that has its own nature and does not map onto human categories of intent. The woman had found it familiar because familiar was her mind's best attempt at describing the recognition of something genuinely old. The truck driver had seen his daughter in its passenger seat because the road had no interest in frightening him, but had also no understanding of what it would mean to him to see her there, no orientation toward his terror or his grief, or the particular way that love becomes a wound when the person it belongs to is gone. It had simply reflected something of what he carried. The commuter had been changed by 11 years of proximity, and the road had recognized that change the way a thing that has existed for a very long time recognizes the accretion of time in those that pass near it, without judgment, without intent, simply as a fact. The surveyor had sat at this spot and felt the orientation and written it down in careful language, and the language had held the fact of it without being able to hold the nature of it, and he had kept the pages separate because he understood that what he had encountered was not wrong and was not right, was not threatening and was not safe, was simply genuinely other in a way that the categories of his professional life and his ordinary language were not equipped to contain. All of this arrived in the silence of the car. I sat with it for a time that I cannot accurately estimate. Time at the 2-mile mark did not behave the way time behaved on either side of it, and I had no experience of the gray light Gerald had described, the dawn that held at its threshold and didn't brighten, but I had my own version of it, a suspension in the ordinary passage of minutes that made duration something I had no reliable access to. I was not afraid. I was not at peace. I was present, fully and without distance, in the oldest place I had ever been. And the oldest place I had ever been was paying me exactly as much attention as I had paid it, which was a great deal, which was 2 years of sustained and careful noticing, returned. After a while I started the car. I turned the radio back on. I put the window down. and I drove toward the eastern junction, the way Owen had driven it and Marcus had driven it and all the others had driven it, back toward the end of the road and the highway and the ordinary world. The distance decreased the way distance is supposed to decrease. The junction appeared, and I pulled onto the highway and drove. The radio played. The window was down. The mountains were dark on both sides, and the highway was empty, and the stars were out over the ridge in the particular density that you only see when you are far enough from the ordinary lights of ordinary places. I drove for 20 minutes before I pulled over and sat on the shoulder and turned the radio off and sat in the quiet for a while. I was shaking. I noted it the way Marcus had noted it, clinically, the hands unsteady, the breathing elevated. I sat until it stopped. I thought about all of them, about the drive that each of them had taken away from the road, and what they had carried with them, and how they had held it in the months and years afterward. The woman who had pulled into the empty gas station and not been able to explain what she was waiting for someone to tell her. The truck driver who had reached a rest stop and sat in his cab until the shaking stopped. The commuter who had driven to work in perfect, ordinary silence and sat in his car in the parking lot afterward and called his wife and said he would be late and not been able to say why. I thought about all of those exits, and I thought about my own, and I understood something about them that I hadn't understood from the outside. The leaving was not relief. It was not the clean end of a frightening thing. It was a transition, a passage from one kind of presence to another, from the full and unmediated attention of being on the road to the ordinary managed distance of being in the world. And the world, re-entered from that, had a particular quality in the first minutes. A slight foreignness. Not alienation, not the estrangement of a person who has been somewhere that has changed them and cannot find their way back to who they were before. Something smaller than that. The slight foreignness of a room entered from a very cold place outside, when the warmth of the room is itself the unfamiliar thing, when the ordinary is the thing that requires adjustment. I sat on the shoulder until the adjustment was complete, until the radio and the highway and the stars over the ridge were simply the radio and the highway and the stars over the ridge, simply themselves, simply the ordinary world I had driven through a great many times on a familiar road. I drove home. I arrived late. My house was quiet and dark and ordinary in every detail that houses are ordinary in when you return to them from something that has no category. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about what to do with what had happened, whether it belonged in the accounts, whether it was the end of them, or whether it was something that needed to remain separate, the way the surveyor's final pages had needed to remain separate, the way some things needed to exist in a different register from the documented record, even when the person holding them wanted the record to be complete. I decided, eventually, that it belonged. That the project had always been moving toward this, toward the narrator finding the road, or the road finding the narrator, because that was the nature of the attention that had organized the project from the beginning. I had spent 2 years being the kind of person who paid careful attention to a specific thing, who collected accounts of it, and assembled them, and made of them a form that could be held and listened to, who drove the highway past the mountain with the window down and the radio on, and let the accounts turn in her mind on the way home. And the road had noticed. Eventually, as Eleanor had understood and the surveyor had felt and all of them had encountered in their different ways, the road had noticed. And on a Tuesday night in late October it had made itself available to be found. So here's what I know, after all of it. After the 7 accounts and the 2 years and the night at the 2-mile mark. The road is real. It runs through the eastern slope of the mountain range, and it appears on maps going back further than any human construction record can account for. It has no beginning. It connects the same 2 points on the highway that it has always connected, and you can drive it in 11 minutes at a moderate speed, and if it keeps you for longer than 11 minutes. And if it lets you go, it lets you go with the slight foreignness of a world re-entered, which fades, which becomes ordinary again, which leaves behind only the memory of full presence and the understanding that the distance we maintain from most things is a kind of protection we don't notice until it's briefly gone. It is older than anything around it. It is older than the settlements and the roads and the surveys and the records and the accumulated human documentation of a region that has been inhabited and mapped and measured and argued over for centuries. It was there before any of that, and it will be there after, and the people who encounter it, who find it or are found by it, are passing through a thing that has its own nature and its own logic and its own relationship to time and attention that does not require human beings to make sense of it, and did not begin when we started noticing it, and will not end when we stop. I have not driven the road again. I have driven the highway past it many times since October. I have not seen the entrance. I do not know if this means the road is not currently interested in being found by me, or whether I am not currently the kind of person it finds legible, or whether the exchange at the 2-mile mark was complete in some way I cannot measure and the road considers our account settled. I think about Gerald waiting in the gray light and deciding not to assume that the world on the other side was still available to him. I think about what it meant to be found in that moment. To have Marcus come through the tree line with his headlamp and his radio and his 12 years of finding lost people. I think about what the found face looks like from the inside. Whether the quality Marcus saw in it, the worn-through quality, the texture of something longer than 10 hours, was the texture of having been fully present in a very old place and then returned to the ordinary world and felt the slight foreignness of it. Whether that texture was grief or recognition, or simply the residue of a presence that doesn't fully leave you when you drive away from it. I think about all of them. I think about them on the highway with the window down and the radio on. I think about a woman who found the road on a winter night and pulled into an empty gas station on the other side of it waiting for someone to tell her it hadn't happened. About a truck driver who drove all night to reach a rest stop and sat in his cab feeling the exact outline of a presence in the passenger seat. About a man who drove the same road every morning for 11 years until the road was done being ordinary. About a surveyor standing at a tree line reading a date that preceded every record of the thing the date was attached to. About a man who walked 4 hours in one direction and arrived nowhere, who waited in a gray light that held at the edge of dawn, whose face held a texture that didn't belong to 10 hours when Marcus found him. About a careful woman in an archive room who understood the difference between looking and being looked at and chose, with full understanding of what the choice meant, not to look anymore. About a surveyor in 1938 sitting at the 2-mile mark writing something irrational down in careful language because he wanted there to be a record of it, because he wanted a witness. I am the witness. That was always what the project was. Not documentation, not research, not the assembly of a record for its own sake, but witnessing, sitting with each account and not requiring it to be more explicable than it was and letting it stand as what it was, which was a true account of a thing that had happened, to a person who had not been looking for it or had been looking for it without knowing and had found it or been found by it and had driven away from it with the slight foreignness of a world re-entered and had eventually, in their own time and in their own way, wanted there to be a record, wanted someone to know the specific texture of what had occurred, wanted the thing that had happened to them to exist somewhere outside of themselves. I know what that is now. I know it in a way I didn't know it before October. The accounts are complete. 7 of them, from 7 different points of entry, 7 different approaches, 7 different people who came to the road through ordinary circumstances and found something that resisted every ordinary category they brought to it. They are complete, and they are true, and they are all the record I know how to make of a thing that has existed longer than records. There is a road in those mountains. It is on every map that has ever been made of that region. It has no beginning. It runs for 4 miles between 2 points on a highway, and in those 4 miles it has its own relationship with time and attention and the particular vulnerability of the kind of person who pays careful attention to things. I have been that kind of person my entire life. The road knew that before I did. It knows a great deal that we don't. It has been knowing things since before there was anyone to know them about. And it is patient. It is the most patient thing I have ever encountered. It will be there long after this record, long after every record, long after the maps and the archive and the surveyor's notes and the catalog entry in the wrong hand. It will be there, and the mountains will be there, and the highway will run past it in the dark and on some nights, for some people, at some point in a drive that began as an ordinary drive and became something else. The entrance will be visible from the highway. A pale wooden post at the roadside. A narrow asphalt lane disappearing into the dark between the trees. And some of those people will pull over. And some of those people will sit on the shoulder for a long time with the engine running and the radio on and think about whether they are the kind of person who turns down that lane. And some of them will decide that they are. And the road will be there for them. The same road it has always been, older than anything around it, aware in the way that only very old things are aware, patient in the way that only things without an end can afford to be. Waiting, not for something specific, not for a particular kind of person or a particular kind of attention, just waiting, the way it has always waited. The way it will wait long after every person who has ever driven it has become, themselves, part of whatever record exists for things that pass through old places and are briefly, completely, known by them. Drive carefully. There is a stretch of mountain highway where the ordinary world and something much older than it sit alongside each other in the dark. Most nights you will pass it without seeing it. Most nights the entrance will not be there. But some nights, if you are the kind of person who has spent a long time paying careful attention to things that resist easy understanding, the post will be at the roadside and the lane will be beyond it, and you will know, immediately and completely, what you're looking at. What you do then is your own. What you drive away with is yours to keep. I have kept mine. This account is yours.